Hi, everyone. Sorry to torture you before spring break, but we really have to cover this topic. I'm gonna try and go fast so that you're not sitting here for 40 minutes listening to me yammer on. Um, I'm gonna share the PowerPoint. You should have the pages of notes that I gave you yesterday in class. And so let's just go over a couple things that we talked about yesterday. The first of which is how do we calculate the reserve requirement? I'm sorry, how do we calculate the money multiplier? The formula for that is 1 over the reserve requirement. But if it tells you that the reserve requirement is, say, 10%, let's all just remember how math works, that we're not going to divide 1 by 10. We're going to divide 1 over zero point 0.1 in order to get the the money multiplier. But this should be pretty familiar for you because um, we already did this with calculating the spending multiplier, but there weren't percents involved with the MPC and the MPS. So I just want to remind you, we're not dividing 1 by 10. If it's 10%, then we need the decimal form of that, which would be 0.10. Okay, so this whole scenario right here is going over the idea of what fractional reserve banking is. That means that a small fraction of all the money that gets deposited continues to get loaned out and loaned out and loaned out and loaned out. And that's how banks make money, literally out of nothing. They make money out of thin air. Remember, I told you it's fake. All money is fake. It's just fake. And so when we loan out and loan out and loan out and loan out, and then that money gets deposited, and then we loan it out again, and then that money gets deposited, and then we loan it out again, that is how we create money. And so we have to use something called the money multiplier to do that. So, a couple of vocabulary reminders. Demand deposits, that is the total money that gets deposited into a bank account, for example, like a checking account, could be a savings account. But the demand deposits, the word demand implies that the owner of the bank account can demand to get that money out of the bank, anytime they want to, because it is technically the property of the person who owns the checking account. It is not the bank's property. They hold it for us. We allow them to loan it out on our behalf, but it is technically our money. That's why we call it demand deposits, because I can demand to have it back. Okay, so then we have required reserves, which is that portion of demand deposits that have to be held in kind of like an emergency fund, so that when people come to the bank on a regular basis and they withdraw and they deposit and they withdraw and they deposit and they withdraw and they deposit, we want to make sure that we have money there and available for the people who want to take a withdrawal out of their account. The bank is required to hold a certain percentage in required reserves for that purpose. We learned our lesson the hard way during the Great Depression when we had the bank run. And we were like, man, we're all out of money. So we are required to hold a certain percentage. All that's left over, besides that small emergency fund, goes into excess reserves. And the key for our definition here is that excess reserves is the money that banks are allowed to loan out. They cannot loan out what is in required reserves. They have to put it there and they can't touch it. But whatever's left over, they can loan out. So loans can only be made out of excess reserves. So, how do we keep track of assets and liabilities, how much our demand deposits are, how much we have in required reserves, how much we have in excess reserves? Well, they have something called a bank balance sheet. And so that is a record of assets and liabilities. And that is constantly changing every day. Banks are constantly updating their balance sheets to indicate the thousands and probably hundreds of thousands and millions of banking transactions that happen on a daily basis. So let's go to the next page. So you have this. Oh, let me erase my little drawing. You have this paper. This is our very first bank balance sheet that we're going to look at. And so let's talk about the two columns. The liabilities, these are the things that the bank owes to other people. So who do they owe this money to? Well, the demand deposits they own to the people who have the checking accounts. And then the owner's equity, sometimes the owner of a bank, like the actual person, will put some of their own money up um, to start the bank going. And so they have actual cash in the bank that got the bank started in the first place. And so the owner has equity in the bank. And so that belongs to the owner. So that's what we owe to other people, and this is what the bank owns. Okay? So we owe that to other people. This is what the bank owns. And so there's a couple of different categories of things. We're not going to worry about treasury bonds today. That is an after spring break you problem. Today, we're just going to talk about how money comes in and goes out of the bank balance sheets. But sometimes on this bank balance sheet, you will simply see reserves as one broad generic category. Sometimes the reserves will be separated out into required reserves and excess reserves. And I am sorry, I can't find my Apple Pencil. I'm using this stupid little um, stylus thing. So I can't write as neat as I would like to for you, but you know what? You're fine. Everybody's fine. Okay. So sometimes on the bank balance sheet, you'll see it separated into required reserves and excess reserves. And if you add up the excess reserves and the required reserves, guess what? You'll get total reserves in the bank. So you have to ask yourself, do we have them separated or are they lumped together? And yes, the College Board is trying to trick you. And so sometimes they're not going to differentiate them, and you have to do that all on your own. Now, going from there, we call it a balance sheet because what we have in assets and what we have in liabilities should be equal to each other. So it is helpful to remember when you're putting money in and taking money out of your balance sheet that at the end of the day, liabilities and assets have to balance each other. So when you're finished doing your math, you need to have the same amount in both columns. And if you don't, then your math ain't mathin', and you need to go back and reassess what you did to double check. So the two totals have to balance. If the bank is holding no excess reserves, how much is the required reserve ratio? So they told us in this example, this bank does not have any excess reserves. So then by definition, if they say there's no excess reserves, how much do we have in actual reserves? $500. So how do we calculate how much they have? What is the, let me try again. What is the reserve requirement? Well, how much do we have in reserves? $500 divided by how much do we have in demand deposits? $5,000. You can bust out your calculator if you want to, or you can do, I don't know, some mental math, up to you. We can wipe out these zeros and we're left with 5 over 50, which would reduce down to 1 over 10, which means that what is the reserve requirement for this bank? 10%. Now, some of you who are good at math are going to look and say, Miss Thies, I don't need to do any math. I can see it with my eyeballs that if they have $5,000 in demand deposits and they have $500 in reserves, I can just look and tell you that that is 10%. Okay, the good for you. But for those of you who need the actual math, this is where we get it. We take the reserves and we divide it by the demand deposits to get a proportion or a percentage. And what we're left with here is 10%. Okay, let's keep rolling. Yes, there's your answer, which I already gave to you. Good job. Okay, so we're going to go with some questions for us. So you have this paper, so follow along with me. Do this on your paper so that you can use it as we go through. So the first question says, what is the required reserve ratio? So on this bank balance sheet, they have separated out for us required reserves from excess reserves. So when we're calculating the reserve requirement, we're only looking at excess, or I'm sorry, we're only looking at required reserves. So $2,000, $20,000. Channing is like, Miss Thies, don't you dare do any math for me. Okay, but that's fine. I am still going to do the math. So $2,000 divided by $20,000. And we can cancel zeros and we're left with 2 over 20, which we know reduces down to 1 over 10, which means that the required reserve ratio for this bank is 10%. You might have looked and said, Miss Thies, I know I can just take my decimal and move it over one. And now I have $2,000, and that means I went 10%. However, you get there is how you get there. There are lots of ways to get there, but I do want to show you the fundamental math behind it. Okay, so first answer, the required reserve ratio is 10%. Okay, so they gave us the scenario and they said that Bob, our good friend Bob, deposits $1,000 into this bank. Okay. So if he put $1,000 into this bank, that means now, let me change color. Let's put it in red. Now we have $21,000 over here in demand deposits. Now, if you haven't done your packet yet, you don't know what M1 money is when it comes to the money supply. So I'm going to give you a little definition. M1 money is all money in circulation, not just cash, dollar bills, but any money that, number one, you have in cash in your wallet, but it also is all money in checking accounts. So when you go to the store and you buy something, if you don't have cash, you just swipe your debit card, and that money is still coming out of the money supply to make that transaction. So money that's in your checking account and cash that's in physical circulation, like actual dollar bills, together make up the M1 money supply. There are a couple other things that also go into the M1 money supply, but you'll get that when you do your reading guide. Okay, so will the M1 money supply initially go up, go down, or stay the same? This is kind of a trick question. It's gonna stay the same because $1,000 in my pocket and $1,000 deposited into my bank account, it's still the same pot of money. It's still coming from the same, you know, bowl, if you will. It doesn't matter. I just take it from one pocket and put it in the other pocket, but it's in the same pair of pants, maybe. Does that help you, right? Like money, cash in my pocket in one pocket and cash in my checking account in the other. I'm just moving it from one pocket to the other. It is not moving, or we have not generated any new money yet. We don't generate a change in the money supply until after we loan it out. You are always going to see this little trick question as part of this type of question. So, what is the change to the money supply initially? That means we've deposited it, but the bank has not done anything with it yet. We don't see a change in the money supply until they actually loan it out. So that's a really important distinction. The question sometimes is going to say, what is the initial change to the money supply? The initial change is nothing. We haven't done anything yet. I just took the money from one pocket and put it into another pocket. But if it'll say what is the total change in the money supply, that implies that the money has been lent out. And then we're going to do those calculations of we lent it out, we use the money multiplier, and now how much is the total impact on the money supply. So initial change is before we loan it out. Total change is after we've loaned it out. And you are going to stumble on that one. So if I were you, I would write myself down a little note right now because that's a really significant distinction to make when going through these types of questions. Okay, so he puts $1,000 into his demand deposits. The next thing says, how much is the required reserves? We already did this. No. Oh, no, they're asking us to do the calculation, right? Let me see. Yes. Okay. So when we take this $1,000, we already know that we have $2,000 in required reserves and $3,000 in excess reserves. So I'm not going to look at the total demand deposits. I'm only going to divide up the amount of the deposit. So we deposited $1,000 and we have to split it into two accounts. One account is going to go into required reserves. One account is going to go into excess reserves. So we need 10%. So $1,000, if we were taking 10% of that, we would just move the decimal over. And so $100 of that $1,000 is going to have to go into required reserves. That means everything that's left over after we've put that $100, the 10% to meet the legal emergency fund requirement, everything that's left over gets to go into excess reserves. So $900 here is going to go into excess reserves. And when you add those two numbers up, they should total the amount of the deposit. So we're going to take $100 and add it to required reserves, which means now I have $2,100 in required reserves. And then I'm going to take the rest of the money and stick it over there into excess reserves. And so now I have, can you see that's a nine? $3,900 in excess reserves. So how much is the required reserves? Required reserves changed to be $2,100. And now in excess reserves, after the deposit, we have $3,900 in excess reserves. Okay. So now it's going to ask us how much more can the bank lend out initially? That means we've deposited the $1,000. How much can the bank lend out? In theory, in total, the bank has $3,900 in excess reserves. But that's not what the question is asking us. The bank is not, they're not asking us how much in total can the bank lend out. They're asking us how much more can the bank lend out? So how much did we add into excess reserves? Well, we added another $900 into excess reserves. So that means the bank has $900 more that it can lend out. So the answer to number 5 is $900. Okay, what's our last question? The last one says, what is the maximum change in the money supply from this deposit? So now we have to do some calculations. Let me think about where I can write this for you so you can see it. Well, it'll be fine. We'll be fine. I'll make room. We already said that the required reserve ratio is 10%. So if we're going to calculate the maximum change to the money supply, we need to calculate the money multiplier. And we know that the money multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement. So the reserve requirement in this case is 10%. So we've got 1 over 0.1, which means that the money multiplier is how much? That's right, 10. Our money multiplier is 10. So I'm going to say 10 as the money multiplier times $900, which was the additional amount that we are now going to loan out, which means that the maximum change in the money supply from this deposit is $9,000. Make sure you put your dollar sign. Okay, we're going to do another one. The next one says, Bob withdraws $3,000 from this bank. So now we have to go backwards. There are a couple of ways that you can do this going backwards because we get a little caught up in, well, if I'm withdrawing the money, am I withdrawing all of it from excess reserves? Am I withdrawing all of it from required reserve? Like, where do I take the money out of? Do I take it out of this one? Do I take it out of that one? The way that has worked best in my mind is to do the same split that we did with the deposit, meaning this much is going into required reserves and this much is going into excess reserves. I do that same split with a withdrawal. So first thing that we have to do is figure out what is the reserve requirement. So the reserve requirement for this one would be 2,000 divided by 20,000, which means that our reserve requirement is 10%. Very often, you're going to get 10% as your reserve requirement. Every once in a while, they throw you a curveball and give you like a 5% or a 20%. But 10% reserve requirement is pretty standard in the banking industry. So this is most often what you will encounter. Okay. So if we have $3,000 that Bob wants to take out, let's split that up into required reserves and excess reserves. 10% of $3,000, you can use your calculator and you can say 3,000 times zero point 0.1. Or the way my brain does 10% is I put my decimal here, I move my decimal over by one, and that tells me that 10% is $300. So $300 is going to be the change in the required reserves. And then the rest of the money, the $2,700, is going to come out of excess reserves. And again, when I add those two together, it should give me $3,000. So I know I need 10%. So I split it like we did before. 10% is $300. The 90% that's left over is $2,700. So then I'm going to go and it's going to say to us, will the M1 money supply initially go up, go down, or stay the same? Have we loaned anything out? No. If we haven't loaned anything out yet, then nothing changes. The M1 money supply is going to stay exactly the same because all I did is take $3,000 from my left pocket of my pants and move it into the right pocket of my pants, but it's still the same pair of pants. We've just moved it from one pocket into the other. No one has lent anything out, nothing new has been generated. So before we loan it out, when it's just the initial deposit or the initial withdrawal, there is no change to the money supply yet. Okay, so trick question, no change. Number two, how much is the required reserves? We already did that. It's 10%. How can I tell that? You tell that by looking at how much is in required reserves and how much is in demand deposits total and get a percentage. How much is the excess reserves? Okay, so now let's go and readjust our numbers. I'm going to take $2,700 out of excess reserves. So $3,000 minus $2,700 means I'm going to take I'm going to have $300 left over. And if I take $300 out of required reserves, now I'm going to have $1,700 in required reserves. And I have to change my total demand deposits. If I took $3,000 out, how much do I have in demand deposits now? I have $1,700. And notice, nope, let me put another zero. JK, $17,000. Notice that your math is all even. If we now have $17,000 in demand deposits, then I should have $1,700 in required reserves. So this is a secondary way of doing this problem. If that first way of doing it worked for you, great, keep doing it that way. The $3,000, split it, subtract it out of required reserves, subtract it out of excess reserves, and then change your demand deposits. That's process number one. You also could do it like this. You could say, all right, I'm taking the $3,000 out of demand deposits. Do that first. Okay. Now I have $17,000. If I have $17,000 in demand deposits, how much do I have to have in required reserves? Well, I have to have $1,700 in required reserves, which means I put, let me try again. I took $300 out. $300. Well, that's not all of the withdrawal. The rest of the withdrawal had to have come from somewhere. So that other $2,700 had to have come out of excess reserves. Pay me now, pay me later. My brain likes doing it the first way. Just split it before you start and take it out of each category rather than adjust it from demand deposits and then readjust your reserve requirements or required reserves and excess reserves. But whatever process works for you, that's you do you, boo. All you got to do is come up with the right answer. Okay, so now after we withdraw the $3,000, we have $1,700 in required reserves to meet that 10% reserve requirement. And then what do we have left over? We have $300 left over in excess reserves. Okay. Assume Bob burned the money. What is the maximum change to the money supply? They don't mean that he like wasted it on frivolous stuff. They literally mean he set it on fire. If he set that money on fire, the money supply is going to change by negative $3,000 because that money was destroyed. I don't know why they ask you that question. Who's taking $3,000 out of the bank to light it on fire? Maybe some rando TikTok influencer that wants to make a shock value video. Oh, check me out, bro. I burned $3,000. Okay, I don't know. I don't think anybody's setting it on fire on purpose, but fine. Okay. If you need more practice with this, our BFF, Jacob Clifford, has a practice YouTube video. If you go to my lesson plans, this video is there. You can click the link and you can do some practice with him if you want to. Let's do this one. This question said, based on the balance sheet above for three different banks, which of the following is true if the reserve requirement is 10%? Okay. So bank number one, if the reserve, notice that they just give us a generic actual reserves category and they don't break it out into required and excess. So we have to do that ourselves. If they have $5,000 and the reserve requirement is 10%, how much should they have in required reserves? Well, they should have $500. But they have a total of $1,000 in actual reserves, which means our required reserves of 500, they also have 500 in excess reserves. Okay. Next, demand deposits of $600, which means that 10% of that would be $60 is what they should have in required reserves, but they have a total of $100, which means that $60 in required reserves and they have $40 in excess reserves. This is a very poor bank. Next, they have $100 in demand deposits and they have $10 in actual reserves. While the required reserves for this bank at 10% should be $10. And they only have $10 in actual reserves, which means they don't have any excess reserves. So let's go through our answer choices. A says Bank A has no excess reserves. Well, that's not true. We just figured out that they have $500 in excess reserves. So, bye. Bank B has no excess reserves. Well, that's false because we've just proved that they have $40 in excess reserves. Bank B can increase its loans by $500. Well, that's not true. They don't even have a total of $500 in actual reserves, so they're definitely not loaning out $500. Bank A could increase their loans by $500 because they have $500 in excess reserves. Remember, we make loans out of excess reserves. So however much is in excess reserves, that's how much the bank has available to loan out to its customers. Bank B can increase its loan by $40. Ding, 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 ding. That's it. Because they have $40 in excess reserves, which means they could loan out $40 in new loans. Bank C has excess reserves. That is false. They have no excess reserves. So you have to go through and figure out your categories first before you can address these answer choices. Okay. Thank you. All right, you have this one on your paper. What I would really like for you to do is pause the video and try this yourself first, and then come back and see if you got the stuff right. So I'm going to work it out, but I think you should pause first and do the calculations yourself. Okay. What is the reserve requirement? Well, if we have $100,000 and we have $10,000, that means that the reserve requirement is 10%. What did I just do? I literally don't even know what I just did. Why? Why did you zoom in, you stupid thing? Y'all. What in the world? Why does mine look like that? Just turn that off. Oh, turn off. Okay. I'm having some iPad issues. I'm old. It's fine. Okay. Next. By how much will the Me Bank reserves change based on Luis's withdrawal? Okay, so if he's taking $5,000 out, 5,000, and we know we're going to split that into required reserves and excess reserves. So, of the $5,000, 10% is $500, which means what do we have left over? $4,500 left over. So his required reserves are going to decrease by $500. So that means we have 9,500 in required reserves, and the $4,500 that's going to come out of excess reserves, that means all he has left in excess reserves is $500. And this is going to change to 95,000. Okay. What is the initial effect of the withdrawal of the M1 measure of the money supply? There's no effect on the money supply. You take it from one out of your bank account and you put it in your wallet. We haven't done anything to change the money supply. We're just moving where that money was stored. So we only generate money in the money supply if we make a loan. Next week's problem for you, if the bank puts some money into treasury bonds, that takes money out of the money supply, but that's next week use problem. Actually, that's 2 weeks from now use problem. So it's fine. Unless, of course, you're watching this at, I don't know, 10:55 Sunday night before we come back to school, then it's tomorrow use problem. But hey, you're grown. Manage your time. Okay. As a result of the withdrawal, what is the new value of excess reserves on the balance sheet? We already did that. New excess reserves, $500. Assume that the next day Johnson withdraws from Metera Bank an amount that exceeds the bank's excess reserves. Assuming that no loans are called in, how can Metera Bank cover its required reserves? That is where the bank is going to have to do a little bit of fancy schmancy banking stuff. And so we're not going to talk about that now. I don't need this video to go any longer. When we get back from spring break, we will talk about what does the bank do if one of their customers comes and takes money that exceeds their excess reserves. We will talk about that when we come back. I think that's the end. Yeah. Okay, my darlings, have a wonderful spring break. Don't be stupid. Don't be stupid. Don't be stupid. That's all. Have a great time. Bye.